Several stories told that created a bridge that the mind has to cross on its route to annihilation, or, as has been put here, to understand the nature of emptiness. So in retelling these stories, for those who have heard them before, dive deeper. See if you can get into the alchemy and make a different equation to that which we came to on Tuesday. But you know, it's been said that we have to be divine physicists. And that's also a route on the way to becoming divine alchemists. But for the moment, to engage the mind in that of being a physicist, and we know what physicists do. They have these equations where they have this plus this equals so and so. So with these stories, we're creating an equation and see what we come to after the equals sign. The first story was about this young man from the West who wanted to attain enlightenment, but he was disillusioned by his endeavors in the West with the schools and modalities that were offered there. So he decided to make a pilgrimage to Asia, the source of these things. And so he made his way to Japan and went to a certain monastery. And when he was presented to the abbot, he asked the abbot, could he qualify to enter the monastery? And the abbot said, well, you know, we know you young people from the West, you know, you're hedonistic, you're individualistic, and you're rebellious. And we're very strict here. We have strict rules that we have to follow. Are you willing to do that? And the young man's shackles came up and he said, yes, I can do it, just tell me what I have to do. And of course the abbot listed a few things that had to be done. You have to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and be at the meditation hall. You have to do your duty and light the incense and tend to the oil burners, and you have to take your duty in the kitchen, and you have to tend to the garden when it's your turn to do so. Oh, yes, 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 said the young man to all of these things. But then as the young man was going about his duties, he noticed that all the other monks, they didn't follow. They slept in, they didn't turn up at the meditation hall, and when it was their duty to stir the rice, they weren't there in the kitchen. They didn't sweep the floors and any of those things. So the young man got very angry about this, and he said, I'll show these Asians what a Westerner can do. So he very assiduously went about his business. He swept the floors, and he stirred the rice, and he tamped the incense burners, and so forth and so on. And then one day the abbot was passing and said to the young man, well, I noticed that you're not at all happy. What is it that's troubling you? And the young man said, well, you told me when I came here that you were very strict about things and that I should follow the rules, and I noticed that others don't follow them at all, so I'm just being an example of how you do what you're told. Well, the old abbot feigned anger, and he said, what you're doing is demonstrating living and working in a state of anger and frustration. That's no example at all. So the young man was very chastened and very humbled by this. So he said to the abbot, please, master, tell me, how should it be then? And the abbot said, when the Buddha takes the Buddha broom and sweeps the Buddha floor and lights the Buddha incense and stirs the Buddha rice, then, and only then, will you be an example to all others. That's our first story. The second story is about that acolyte who also attained to enlightenment, and he'd entered the monastery at a very, very early age. And from that early age, he'd followed the practices, he'd done exactly what was there in all of the rituals that were needed to be followed. He followed them. But after many decades, he still wasn't enlightened. So he went to the abbot, and he explained to the abbot that he was totally depressed and disheartened, because after all of these decades in the monastery, he still had not attained his goal of enlightenment. And the old abbot looked at him and he said, well, next week is our special festival where we fast and we follow certain rituals that are very, very strict. My suggestion is to you that you give your whole heart to this week of intense meditation and discipline. And if after you haven't been enlightened after that, you better kill yourself. So the man decided that this is what he would do. He would give it his heart and his soul. And this is exactly what he did. He followed, he fasted, he prostrated himself, all of the things that one does with flagellation and so forth. And then the week was finished, and it hadn't happened. He still wasn't enlightened. So with great resolve, he went up the stairs of the monastery to the highest tower in the monastery, and with great determination, he walked over to the edge of the parapet and put his leg over to jump. And then it happened. In an instant, he was enlightened. So he went racing down the stairs to inform the abbot. And when he went into the abbot's chambers, the abbot said, yes, I know, you passed through the gateless gate. Now get out. That's our second part of our equation. And the third story is a story about that king who used to go out quite often into the streets of his realm, dressed as a simple peasant, just to see how all his people were faring. And one day when he was out on a balmy night and walking through the streets of the town, down at the end of the street he noticed a very simple hut that seemed to have a glow and aura about it. And when he traversed the street and came closer, he saw that there was just a simple candle burning in the window. And he couldn't understand why this house had such an aura about it, a light that seemed to emanate. And then he looked in the window and he could see a poor man with his wife sitting over a very simple supper with a little glasses of wine. And as he stood there, he heard the poor man chanting quietly, intoning, and it perplexed him. So he went to the front door and he knocked on the door, and when the poor man answered the door, the poor man asked who he was after giving the usual greetings to strangers, and the king replied that, he was a traveller and he was seeking hospitality. Could he come in? And of course the poor man invited him in, and he was given part of the simple repast and a small glass of wine. And then the poor man went back to his intoning and his chanting, and after he'd completed that, the king asked him, well, what do you do for a living? And the poor man said, I'm a shoemaker. I repair people's shoes in the town. I go out each day and mend the soles, and that's how I earn enough to feed my wife and myself. Oh, said the king, well, I notice that you don't have any children to take care of you. What are you going to do when you get old? And the poor man said, I have no thought of this. I have faith that it will be taken care of. So the king was very perplexed by these several things that were there. And so he took his leave of the poor man and he said, can I come back again? And the poor man said, yes, you're always welcome. But the king went back to his palace and he thought, I'm going to test this fellow. find out what he's about. So the very next day he made an edict, and he sent out his cries into the town that no one was allowed to repair shoes in the town anymore. So the poor man was out a livelihood when he went out to do his repairs the next day. But he noticed a man carrying water down the streets, and he thought, oh, I can be a water carrier. So he carried water from the well and took it to the people of the town. Well, the king visited again and asked him, well, how did you fare after the king made his edict that you were not allowed to mend shoes? And the man said, oh, I have now become a water carrier, and now I have enough to feed my wife and myself. Well, the king, still perplexed, he went off, and the very next day he made another edict. He sent out cries to say no one was allowed to carry water in the town. So again, the poor man was out a livelihood. So again, of course, the king visited him, but as it happened, the poor man noticed that there were some wood choppers passing with their axes on their shoulder to get wood from the forest. So he thought, I can become a wood chopper. So he became a wood chopper. Then when the king came and asked him what happened after he could no longer be a water carrier, he said, oh, well, now I've become a wood chopper, and I chop wood together, so I have enough for my wife and family. Well, again, of course, the king, not satisfied with what had transpired the very next day, he ordered his soldiers to go out and round up all of the wood choppers. They were to be made into guards at his palace. They were to be given uniforms and swords, and they were to stand guard outside his palace. Well, of course, amongst those wood choppers was our poor man. And in his uniform and with his sword on duty, he discovered that guards did not get paid but once a month. And he had a month and he had no money to buy food, nothing that he could put on his table. What was he to do? So, being a man of some ingenuity, he thought to himself, well, I have this shining sword. So what he did, he whittled himself a wooden sword and replaced it in the sheath, and he took the shining bright sword that had been given to him by the king, and he went out and sold it. And he had enough money to feed his wife and himself for a month. So when the king came to visit him this time, and he asked, well, of course the poor man told him very honestly what had happened. And so the king asked me, well, what would happen if the king found out about this? He'd be in deep trouble. Oh, said the poor man, I don't think about things like this. I have faith. I don't worry about what is not yet to come. So the very next day, the king ordered that all of the townspeople were to be gathered in the town square because there was a thief who was to be beheaded. He'd stolen melons from the king's garden, and he was to be beheaded in front of all the people. So when all the people were gathered, of course, amongst them was the poor man in his guard's uniform, and the king instructed that he would be the one to lop the thief's head, none other than the poor man. So the poor man said to the soldiers who came to get, no, please, I've never killed anyone in my life. Please don't ask me to do this. The soldier said, well, this is the king who's told you to do this. If you don't do that, your head will be lopped. So what could the poor man do? He had to be taken up to the dais where the thief was standing, and the king and his entourage. And so the poor man thought for a moment, and he turned to those who were standing there, and he said, please, could you just give me a few moments that I can pray? So the poor man bent his head in prayer, and then he looked up and he said loudly to everyone who was there, Lord, you know that I'm a poor man and that I've never killed anything or anyone in my life. So please please help me. If this man is guilty, may his head be lopped easily and quickly. But if he is innocent, may my sword be made of wood. And he took out his sword and raised it in front of all the people, and they all cheered. So the king said to the poor man, "Do you know who I am?" And the poor man went up and peered at him, and he said, "Why, you're the man who's been visiting my house the last 4 times." "Yes," said the king, "and you've proven yourself to be a man of not only great faith, but also great ingenuity. I want you to become my advisor and live in my palace." And that's exactly what happened to him and his wife. Now if we take these 3 stories and we make our equation out of them, first of all we have to ask the question, what does the first story represent? What was it that arose out of this first story for you as maybe a lesson or a deep, deep truth that arose? What was the key to the change that took place in this young man when the abbot feigned anger?
It's like instead of trying to do everything right, being in alignment with this rightness, with that goal.
Yes, but bring it down to a word. What happened to him? What happened to us in our life? What has happened to us in our life?
We can only serve God from our heart.
Yes, but simplify it. Bring it down to a word.
Congruence. We've become congruent.
Simple. Simplify. What is it that's happened to us? We know what happened to us. What launched us on our spiritual journey? What that followed, but what came before that?
Humility.
Humility. Humbled. He was humbled. He was humbled, wasn't he? Okay, so we've got our first part of our equation. But what about the second part, where after so many years of struggling and striving and trying and doing his best to be good? Right. Surrender. So we have the second part of our equation. And what about the third story? What arose out of that for you? What was it about this poor man?
He had faith.
He had faith. He had faith. So when we put these 3 together, humility, surrender, and faith, what do we get?
No resistance.
No resistance, right. Yes, no resistance. Can we give it a word? Can we make a summation of it? Can we make an equation out of it?
Empowerment.
Empowerment? Yes, empowerment. So leaving that for a moment to work its chemistry, because, like in Einstein, you have to go out and get on the bus and have a little nod off, and then it comes to you. How could this be related when it said that we need the mind to cross this bridge on its path to annihilation? What could this mean for us? Knowing that the mind, like those stories have depicted and shown us, that the mind is the instrument of our liberation. Our jailer, our master, all of those things it's been for us. But in the end, we recognize that it's the instrument of our liberation, whatever that is. But for the moment, we can say that these stories, which make an equation that the mind can grasp, is a bridge to annihilation. How can this be? But first, let the chemistry of the stories work in their own way to bring that which for you is after the equals sign of this. Because we are divine scientists, we are divine physicists. We do know. And to do what's there for us to do, we need to be able to give expression to it, give it words, so that we have all the tools we need to do what there is for us to do. Thank you. Onem.